The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. As you know, my name is Carmen Boone. I'm the Education Coordinator from Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center, a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital. Our agency mission is to promote access to quality health care through community and educational partnership. Today, I will be your host and moderator. On your GoToWebinar control panel, you will notice that all microphones are muted. They'll remain muted during this session. If you're experiencing audio difficulties, please make sure your computer speaker volume is turned up or use the phone option to listen in. You may download today's slides from the handouts menu. If you have trouble, no worries, we'll email you the slides tomorrow or later today. Use the questions menu for typing questions or comments at any time. We'll be answering your questions at the end. If we're not enough time, we'll answer them via email. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll send you the link on our email as well. If you have questions, please email me at the email address that you see in front of your screens. To obtain CME or CE credit or a certificate of attendance for this activity, you need to log into eats.com and enter this activity code. It's 72FECK. Please write this down for your records and consider that this activity code expires in 1 week. We will email you the instructions as well, and we will repeat the activity code at the end of the webinar. This presentation is jointly provided by Samaritan Health Services, Oregon AHEC, Oregon Health and Science University, and Oregon Pacific AHEC. The presenters and the planner of this activity report that we have no conflicts of interest or relevant financial relationships with any commercial entities that might affect the contents of this presentation. And this webinar is presented by Tina Ronian and Joan Fleischman. Dr. Ronian is a professor in the Department of Family Science and Community Health at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She's a nationally recognized leader in collaborative care, which focuses on bringing accessible mental health care into medical settings, especially for underserved communities. Dr. Fleischman completed her graduate training at Pacific University School of Professional Graduate Psychology and completed a fellowship in primary care psychology at University of Massachusetts Medical School. She was the former behavioral health clinician director for OHSU's Department of Family Medicine from 2014 to 2020, leading behavioral health services, primary care-based medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, and trauma-informed care implementation. Both Tina and Fleischman and Joan are co-founders of Tent Health and specialize in providing mental health care to the community. Now, without further ado, I'm going to leave you with Christine and Tina. Sorry, Tina and Joan. And let's start this presentation.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hear spring is definitely coming in Oregon. So Joan texted me pictures of blooming daffodils this morning. So I don't know if that's just in her little footprint in Portland or if that's throughout the state. I'm in Massachusetts, and we have yet to experience such wonder coming up out of the ground when things appear to be dead and yet show once again that they are alive, and hoping for some of that in our neck of the woods soon. So good morning. We're pleased to be here. I think we probably are a familiar voice to some of you by now as we've been doing this series. And I welcome you back if this is a return visit for some of our offerings. And if this is your first time here, a warm welcome to you as well. I'm going to try to present my slides here, and it would be great if you have access to the chat, just to get a sense of who's here and to kind of engage another part of your learning. If you want to chat in kind of where you're tuning in from in terms of your agency and what your role is, that would be great. It gives us a sense of who's here, and hopefully to be able to make some of the examples relevant. Today's session is going to be largely a didactic session, but if you have been participating, you know that we do these in a series. And so we are now on our third dyad of content presentations, where today we're going to be talking about self-compassion in clinical practice, a powerful skill during high stress times. And in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a practice lab, and that's a much more interactive, intimate format on Zoom, where we really do get to be in dialogue and to practice some of the content of what we're going to be presenting today. So today is largely cognitive, and then in the practice lab, we'll kind of drop it down and have a little more interactive and bring it into the application space. And then just a quick little preview. This was where we have 2 series. This is the ending of our first series, but we will be coming back to you starting next month, and we have a second series that we are going to offer in the same format of pairing some didactic information with practice lab on topics such as mindful practice, mindful clinical practice, compassionate leadership, and mindful communication. And those are going to be offered during the noon time, so your time at noon. And the dates will be forthcoming through emails from Carmen and AHEC. As Carmen said, we don't have any conflicts of interest for this presentation today. We, Joan and I, are co-founders of Tent Health, where we care very deeply and are dedicated to the amelioration of burnout and mental health difficulties among health professionals, and we provide a variety of different mental health and well-being services to individuals and to organizations. But that's not the purpose of us being here today. We just want to share some content with you that hopefully can help you during your clinical practice. So we're going to be talking about self-compassion, which might be a term familiar to all of you, but we're going to dissect it a little bit and go into a little more detail to talk about components of self-compassion, to really look at what are some of the resistances and myths about self-compassion, look a little bit about the scientific underpinnings of self-compassion, introduce some self-compassion skills, and hopefully that you will be able to walk away with a self-compassion skill that you feel like you might be able to use and practice, and then hopefully bring that back to the practice lab, and you can tell us what your experience was, and again, we can unpack it even further. So with that, I'll get started. And before we can talk about compassion, I want to talk about things that are similar to compassion, but not quite compassion. And sometimes we get these confused both internally and in our expression of these. So pity, which most of us have probably felt before and maybe even experienced, is this feeling sorry for and acknowledging that somebody is worse off than you. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of pity, it can feel very diminishing. It can make you feel very small and unworthy even, because the hierarchy of that expression, while perhaps well intended, is one that is shrouded in a sense of hierarchy, and can invoke that sense of unworthiness. So most of us don't want to be pitied, to be on the receiving end of pity. And this idea that you are feeling sorry for someone because they are worse off than you is just sort of a little cautionary tale about the sense of pity. Sympathy is something we often express, and there's whole categories of this, right, in the Hallmark store of sympathy cards, where it's an acknowledgement that somebody is suffering, perhaps with illness or loss or some other kind of hardship, and those are plentiful these days over the past year of COVID. And so sympathy is an expression of that acknowledgement, and can be well received, doesn't necessarily have to invoke that sense of hierarchy, but oftentimes there's still a distancing when we express sympathy for someone, because we're acknowledging that they're in that point of suffering and we're on the other side of the street. And so there can be a felt experience of kind of separation or distancing, if you will, from that person and from ourselves to that person. And so this is where empathy and teachings around clinical empathy have been so strong in health professional training in particular, and the idea that, sort of the holy grail of empathy. And there's really some wonderful aspects of empathy where somebody really feels seen and heard. And it's that ability to connect with somebody and for them to feel that experience of empathy. So we have all been both the person offering empathy, and we've all been on the receiving end of empathy, and we know that difference, right? Sympathy is this expression with a little bit of detachment because it's not a shared experience, where when we feel empathy, we feel like somebody's in there with us. Somebody really is seeing us and hearing us and getting us from perhaps a shared experience at that moment. And while that is very, very valuable for people to feel truly understood, when you are in a work environment that is saturated with suffering, which is true for many of us in health professional careers, maybe not 100% of the time, but a much greater percentage of the time than people in many other career fields. When that kind of suffering is around you all the time, being in that place of empathy for many hours of a day can have a deleterious effect on the caregiver, because you are marinating yourself in that shared experience of suffering. And you're doing that really not just from an emotional standpoint, or not just from a cognitive standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, and as we'll see, even from a neurochemical standpoint. And so there can be some real implications of that over time, the chronicity of that, and the intensity and the duration of that. And so this idea of standing in compassion is one that has these elements of empathy for somebody to really feel seen and heard, without dropping into this place of really shared experience neurochemically. So that's really where we're going to focus. Before we turn to self-compassion, we first have to sort of know and be in a shared understanding of what I mean by compassion. And so I like this particular definition of compassion because it has these core elements that are known to be sort of critical for compassion, which is a basic kindness that exists because we are aware of suffering. We're aware of suffering in others, which actually makes us capable of being aware of suffering in ourselves. We are aware of suffering in living things, which means we have the capacity to see and appreciate that suffering is a shared experience that none of us actually get out of this great experiment of human life without suffering. So it's this awareness, it's an awareness that it is an experience of others and an experience in ourselves, that we meet with kindness and a desire to alleviate in some small way, a desire to alleviate that suffering. Sometimes that's coupled with an agency to do it, and sometimes we actually don't have the right tool to alleviate that suffering, which can cause its own sort of suffering. But when we rest in compassion, we trust that our intention, our desire is to alleviate that suffering, even if we can't do it all the time or do it perfectly. And most of us can appreciate that sense of compassion. It probably really resonates with you, not only in your work, but in your life. We all have various roles as caregivers, in a sense, in our life, or just in connection with people in our lives, that when they are suffering, we become aware of it through either their words or their body language or behavior. We become aware of it. We have some desire to alleviate it and make it better, and we want to bring some basic kindness to that. That's the essence of compassion. And even just sort of looking at some of these images, we can intuit this sense of shared humanity, this sense of compassion, even without words, right? We can see the actions and the gestures of compassion where we connect into some suffering, we become aware of it, and we have this desire to alleviate it in some small way. And I like to start with this baseline of what compassion is, even though we all kind of know it generally, to think about it in this way before we move to applying it to ourselves. Because my experience with working with a lot of healthcare professionals is that it can be very, very high on this sense of compassion and kindness for others, but can really struggle with how do I bring that same quality of compassion to myself. And so a lot of people rest in this lower left-hand square, where we're over and over again showing up in kindness for others, but not so much for ourselves. And yet we want to believe that we are truly compassionate people. And so my call to you, my challenge, is really to think about how to begin to shift a little bit further to this bottom right square that I will call true compassion, where not only do you have kindness for others and an awareness and desire to alleviate suffering in others, you actually can begin to cultivate that same sense of compassion for and with yourself. And the wonderful thing that we now know from more recent neuroscience is that the neurocircuitry of compassion, which is mediated by oxytocin and dopamine, and if you've been to some of our previous sessions, you know about these two hormones, these neuropeptides in particular, oxytocin and dopamine. And what we're finding from people who are in PET scans or functional MRIs is that this is the neurocircuitry that exists whether or not you are witnessing compassion, you are seeing it live or even seeing it through a screen, whether you are the recipient of compassion from somebody, whether you are offering and delivering compassion to somebody, or amazingly, whether you are offering that compassion to yourself. You get the same neurochemical bump in all of these aspects of compassion. So you don't necessarily have to be just offering compassion to benefit neurochemically. You can do that through witnessing, through vicariously sensing compassion. And also when we begin to offer compassion to ourselves, we can leverage this same neurochemical bump, which I think is really important to understand for how self-compassion is helpful to us. So self-compassion has 3 elements. When we think about self-compassion, most times, people can think like, oh, that's just being nice to myself. Well, there's actually 3 elements to self-compassion, and each one of them is critical. And so the first and almost necessary, not sufficient, but necessary element of self-compassion is a sense of mindfulness, which in other terms is just really about that awareness component. And to be aware in the moment that this is suffering for you. This is suffering as it shows up with sadness or loss, suffering as it may show up with pain, and even suffering as it might show up with frustration or anger. That can be a sense of suffering. So to have this awareness in the moment, the awareness real time that, oh, this is a moment of suffering. And to know in your own body, how do you know that? I know that because I'm feeling really tight and contracted. I know it because there's a lump in my throat or a pit in my stomach. So the sense of awareness, back to that definition, that this is a moment of suffering, without getting too fixed into it where we get too trapped in our own story. The second component of self-compassion is a sense of common humanity. And if you think back to that definition of compassion, you'll see that here as well, which is suffering is a universal human experience. That however you may be suffering right now in this moment, a pain in your knee, a pain in your shoulder, a heaviness on your heart, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are actually suffering in that exact same way in their body or in their emotions at this moment, which is not to diminish your own experience, but just to create some wider awareness that, yeah, this human experience brings the full panoply of emotions, including suffering. And I'm not alone. I'm not alone in this moment of suffering. And then it's this third element that is often equated with self-compassion, which is self-kindness. How do I bring the same level of kindness to myself that I am inclined to bring when I become aware and notice anybody else's suffering? What is the kindness that I'm inclined to bring when a client or a patient that I'm seeing begins to sob or curl into a ball out of that sense of pain or suffering? How am I inclined to respond? In my body language, verbally, in my heart? And self-kindness is just that. How can I bring that same pretty reflexive for most of us aspect of compassion to myself when I become aware of a moment of suffering? So that's what we mean by self-compassion. That's what the term self-compassion means. It has all of those elements. And what the science is telling us now about self-compassion, and I'm not going to go into the diverse studies that are here, but you can see that there is actually a long and growing list of what self-compassion is correlated with. And when people are higher and get higher on self-compassion, you see not only reductions in common mental health symptoms and states like anxiety and depression and shame, but you also see increases in overall sense of life satisfaction, self-confidence, that people can deal with the stresses of life and the unwelcome stresses in life like pain or situational stressors like divorce better. You see enhanced immune functioning because we are actually caring for the inner workings of our system. improved relationships, and being kind to yourself has a multiplier effect of our ability to show up with compassion and empathy and altruism for others. It allows us to be forgiving of ourselves and to take a wider perspective. So there's lots of good reasons to cultivate self-compassion, and particularly with health professionals and clinicians. There is a newer study where a self-compassion program in healthcare was shown to decrease depression, stress, secondary traumatic effects, and burnout, and increase, not surprisingly, self-compassion and mindfulness, but also job satisfaction in healthcare professionals. And sometimes it can feel like, oh, I don't even have enough compassion for all the work I'm doing. You're asking me to be now compassionate with myself too. And so it's one of the reasons why that U-turn towards oneself and bringing compassion to yourself actually deepens the well. It deepens your capacity and availability to be compassionate with and for others. It may seem paradoxical, but the research does sort of bear this out over and over again. And once you begin with your own practice of self-compassion, you will begin to see how true this is. When we turn towards and resource ourselves, and when we turn towards ourselves in moments of suffering to be kind to ourselves, that actually allows us greater capacity. It doesn't shrink our capacity. And we don't bring compassion and kindness to ourselves for the explicit purpose of making it better or changing it. If we think back to that definition of compassion, you have the desire to alleviate the suffering, and it doesn't always do it. It doesn't always do it for others, and it can't always do it for ourselves. So you don't comfort somebody who's suffering in front of you because you know that it's going to change their conditions, right? You don't comfort somebody in the face of a loss because you think it's going to undo that loss. You comfort them and you bring compassion because you have the recognition and a desire to alleviate that suffering in some small way. And that's true for us too. We don't bring compassion to ourselves to just snap out of it. We bring compassion to ourselves because we are feeling down. And it may or may not change the actual experience in the moment. So why is self-compassion so hard? What gets in the way of being kind to ourselves? Well, most of us have not grown up on a steady diet of self-compassion. In fact, most people in health professions have grown up actually with a sense of being fairly perfectionistic or highly driven towards self-improvement. And the tool that we bring to bear for that is often a high level of self-criticism. And so we end up with habit loops and patterns that in that moment of suffering actually create some very short-term positive impact by either decreasing our negative impact or actually bringing some positive impact. And when those habit loops are formed early and when they are repeated so often, it can be very hard to disentangle from them. So this practice of self-compassion, this work of self-compassion is very much an active process to begin to dismantle old feedback loops and develop new habit loops. And so I'm always reminded of the one of the little stories in The Little Prince. If any of you know the book The Little Prince, it's a sort of a children's book, definitely an adult book. And the little prince is going around to the planets to sort of understand kind of this human experience. And one of the planets he inhabits is by a man who is drinking, and he asks the man, "Why are you drinking?" And the man says, "To forget." He says, "Well, to forget what?" He was feeling sorry for him. "To forget that I'm ashamed." And he says, "Well, what are you ashamed of?" And the man says, "That I'm drinking, that I drink." To which the little prince was quite puzzled and again claimed that grown-ups are very confusing and very curious and went about his way. But this is true for a lot of us, right? Why am I binging on Netflix? Or why am I in the pantry again when I'm not even hungry? Or why am I having that fourth beer, right? Whatever it is for us, that those loops get formed because they work in the short term, but often they create some challenges in the long term. But it's one of the reasons why being kind to ourselves can be really hard. And there's a couple of thinking patterns that are quite pernicious in this way. And my work with health professionals really has shown me that this self-critical voice really can be at the root of why it can be so hard to bring kindness to ourselves. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of these categories of self-critical thinking styles that I think are common and quite present really high barriers, high hurdles to developing this habit of self-compassion. And so one is called labeling, where we make derogatory statements about ourselves. We label ourselves, or maybe sometimes other people too, based on a behavior. So instead of separating the behavior from the person, we collapse those, we merge those, and we assume that the person is the behavior, essentially, that the behavior represents the person. And we can do that with ourselves very easily. A sense of shoulding, putting a lot of expectations on ourselves in our head. I should do this, I shouldn't do that, I should, which creates a whole laundry list of things that can actually enhance suffering. And then a sense of overgeneralizing, taking one negative thing and assuming that this applies to everything. So some very specific, concrete examples of labeling would be calling yourself a name, right? Making a mistake and saying, right, I am an idiot. That's mistaking the behavior, you know, I made a mistake for you as a person. Shoulding, I should be able to do this. I should be able to handle it. I shouldn't be tired. I shouldn't lack compassion. I should want to take this extra shift. Sense of overgeneralizing can show up in things like always and never. These are usually good little flag words for thinking that we have taken one instance and we begin to generalize it into the future or into the past, like that never, meaning never in the past and never in the future, or always. So those are some unhelpful thinking styles that I think are quite common and significant barriers to self-compassion. So we'll do this more in the practice lab, but I would love for you to contemplate, if you will, to reflect on. And if you are coming to the practice lab, maybe spend some time with these questions, because those patterns that I mentioned, the patterns of moving away from suffering, are habitual. But the other thing that's very habitual and patterned is, when does this voice of self-criticism and enhancing suffering come in for you? What kinds of things do you commonly criticize yourself for? For most of us, those are very patterned, right? They may be something in the professional realm. They may be something about our aesthetic, how we look. They might be something about our abilities. They might be something about what we're capable of, but they tend to be quite repetitive. And when those occur, what do you say to yourself? What does that voice sound like? And in particular, because I'm a psychologist, does it remind you of anyone? is this an inherited voice? Is this a voice that you can tag on to either witnessing or hearing much earlier in your life that was at first outside of you and then became internalized? And so this kind of inquiry can be really elucidating to know for ourselves the work in front of us for self-compassion, and in particular, the barriers to self-compassion. Because that self-critical voice that is probably here for all of us, what happens when we activate it, even though we may think that self-critical voice is the linchpin to my self-improvement, that self-critical voice is the only thing that makes me better next time. Actually, what happens is when you have that self-critical voice, your threat system, which we've talked about in previous sessions, your threat system gets activated, because oftentimes that voice is pretty harsh, it's pretty loud, it's pretty pointed, and our threat system, we are actually threatening ourselves. And so that pain and suffering actually increases. And the big thing that can happen in those instances is it recruits shame. And I have yet to find anybody who can be in an honest and earnest path of self-improvement with shame present and staring them in the face. Shame makes us small. Shame makes us feel worse. Shame keeps that threat system alive. And it's not actually the birthplace for self-improvement. And so I invite you to sort of just begin to pay attention. So you don't have to believe me based on what I'm saying, but I invite you to pay attention for yourself when that voice gets activated, because it's the real impediment to self-compassion. If we feel shame, we are not in that place of being kind to ourselves. And so we can't control things that happen. This parable of the two arrows, if you will. We all experience pain and upsets and unwelcome stress in our life. That's that first arrow that hits us like, ouch, I didn't want that to happen. And then as humans, we are uniquely capable of bringing in all of our kind of cognitive and emotional stuff to this ouch and go on that path of being very self-critical. I always do this. I always get myself into these things. I'm never going to be able to fix this. I am, stupid. I'm an idiot. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. That's the second arrow. And we don't have any control over what life sort of throws at us. We have very little control over that. We do, however, have some control as we begin to learn these skills of self-compassion, of how do I meet that ouch? How do I meet that first arrow? And most of us are pretty patterned of meeting that first arrow with jabbing ourselves with a second arrow of suffering and pain and shame. And that's a really hard place to move towards kindness, and a really hard place to move towards self-improvement. So I invite you to pay attention to that, to see if that's true for you at all, and to see this just putting this question out there, which we'll have a chance to unpack further in the practice lab. How does a lack of self-compassion show up for you? And we're all fairly patterned in some ways. So when you get bad news, when something doesn't go right for you, what happens next? Not as a source of being critical of yourself, but to bring awareness. When we can shine the light of awareness on that, then we have an opportunity to do something about it. Now, there are a fair number of myths, if you will, around self-compassion. And people can resist, like, oh, if I'm just so syrupy sweet to myself and so kind to myself, maybe that's going to look like pity to myself or sympathy, or that is very weak. I'm never gonna improve. I'm always gonna be complacent with exactly how I am if I'm just nice to myself. when something goes wrong. Or a sense of people feel like, oh, well, that's really narcissistic to never be able to look at your faults or look at the things that you did wrong. That's narcissistic. Or that's kind of selfish to bring that kindness to yourself if something went wrong. And so again, I invite you to just examine to see if any of those may be true for you. If any of these things are showing up for you as a little bit of resistance when you think about being kind to yourself. So with lots of good evidence to say self-compassion is none of these things. Again, people who are self-compassionate, it's not a sense of weakness or complacency. They actually can show greater self-confidence, greater career progression, greater ability to overcome things and to improve, but also not with a sense of narcissism. Because like I said, when you have greater self-compassion, actually it grows your capacity to be empathetic and compassionate towards others. It doesn't shrink it. So we have good scientific evidence to suggest that it is not these things, it's not correlated with these things, but I very much invite you to name these concerns that you may have, because these are the barriers for you about bringing this skill. And we have an opportunity to work with that once we can name what are the reasons why I am hesitant to be compassionate to myself. What's getting in the way that I think that this is not going to serve me well. And a little bit also of a cautionary tale and a warning that just like when a fire is deprived of oxygen and you open a window or open a door and it gets a renewed source of oxygen, you can get an explosion, right, called a backdraft. For some of us, being kind to oneself, to letting you care for you, is such a foreign experience and is so difficult that it can create a lot of discomfort. So as you begin to first kind of cognitively wrap your head around this idea of being compassionate to yourself, and then maybe begin to practice some of the strategies about being compassionate to yourself, just know that if you experience some unrest, if you experience some dis-ease in your body, some anxiety with being kind to yourself, to showing yourself that kindness, to know that that is very common. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. In fact, it probably means that you're doing it right. However, it's unfamiliar. And so that is information too. And to notice that as just another call to bring some kindness to yourself and to do it in little bits in a way that feels tolerable. But to know that if that occurs for you, it's not unusual, and it's information. So how do we do this thing? How do we do this thing of self-compassion? This is an invitation for a self-compassion break that just incorporates very quickly these three elements that I talked about of self-compassion, which is noticing that this is a moment of suffering. This is a moment of being sad. This is a moment of being overwhelmed, or a moment where you noticed you did something wrong or you forgot something, let's say. Very common in this time of the past year of forgetting stuff because our stress response is just pretty activated. And so, oh, I was supposed to do this. I totally forgot. That's so unlike me. But to know that that's a moment of suffering, that this is a human experience. And then this question, how can I care for myself right now? To pause and to ask and allow that answer to bubble up, which is not how do I, necessarily like make up for it, or how can I beat myself up for the fact that I forgot this, but how can I care for myself right now? Because this is a moment of suffering. And this doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to take long. It doesn't mean that you say like, oh, the way I can care for myself by going on a cruise, or it doesn't have to be these large indulgent things. It can just be in the moment, right? To catch that self-critical voice and to know like, right, Other people have been forgetting a lot of things now lately too. It's really common right now. So that's an invitation for a self-compassion break that just brings in those three elements. I'm aware of it. This is a human experience. What do I most need right now? How can I care for myself right now? And most of us are pretty asking ourselves that question when we're suffering, particularly if we feel like we did something wrong or we missed something, is a really, it's not a habitual practice for most of us. Whereas if our friend forgot something they were supposed to do, even if they forgot something that they were supposed to do for us, how might we meet that situation? We might normalize it, recognize it, and then offer something that may or may not, help them feel better, but offer something because they're feeling so down. And it's that same thing. So sometimes thinking about, how can I care for myself? Another practice of self-compassion that some people really resonate with, so we'll work with these more in the practice lab, is this concept of RAIN that has been popularized by a psychologist and meditation teacher named Tara Brach. And RAIN stands for, obviously the elements are here, you recognize, it's that moment of mindfulness, right? You recognize what's happening. You allow for it. This is because I'm human. And you bring some curiosity to it, some very intentional attention to say, what's going on with me right now? What voice is there? What's being activated? Kind of getting closer to the suffering instead of what our pattern is, right? Is to do the thing that turns us away from that, which includes, by the way, being critical of ourselves. Being really critical of ourselves is a way to turn away from the suffering. It feels like we're doing something because we messed up. So we be critical of ourselves. We shame ourselves because it's doing something. So instead of that, to see if you can turn towards it a bit, investigate what is here for you. What is that voice? What is that narrative that's happening? And then nurture, which is that same sense of self-kindness. What is called for right now? How can I best take care of myself? And this is often the most challenging people, even if people can pause and stop and begin to see the critical voice, this idea of nurture, this idea of caring for oneself can be a real challenge. So here's a couple suggestions or a couple questions that might move you a little closer to this. So how might I treat a friend in this same situation? Right, so you just cognitively imagine, like, what if this was my friend, right, who forgot something, who didn't do something perfectly, who meant to do something and didn't get to it, who snapped at somebody even though she knows she was in the wrong for being irritable. How might I treat a friend who's in the same situation? What might I say to him or her? How might I be with them in a way that is compassionate?
This is Joan. I'll put my camera on so you guys can see me too. I love this, and I think that I'm curious if you can speak to why it is so hard to talk to ourselves like we would talk to a friend or a family member. Like, why is that so hard?
My best guess is our patterning, is our historical patterning and learning that is both familial and cultural, societal. And then particularly once you get into health professional training, this voice of self-criticism is modeled and reinforced. So once you get into this pathway of being around a lot of health professionals and to training in this way, you have really inculcated not just the voice of self-criticism, but the belief that that is actually the fulcrum to betterment. And so if it's patterned early and it's continued and reinforced, it's really, really hard because you have a neurocircuitry that's actually so set up to do that, probably on automatic pilot, probably outside of your conscious awareness until we can bring some mindfulness to it. It's just happening automatically. Does that track?
Yeah, I just I wanted for everyone to hear that, because I think it's such a simple thing to say, okay, how would you treat a friend? And I think so many people's reactions is like, oh God, I would never say that to my friend. Like I would never say what I say to myself to a friend. And just to unpack that a little bit about why that is, that we can be so sometimes horrible to ourselves, and sometimes so have so much contempt for ourselves. And to think about, you know, this isn't a moral failing or something about you, that it's really very cultural and very much around the environment and messages you received as a young person and in these times of development and training. So thank you.
Yeah, that word of contempt is sticking with me, because I think that's really accurate, because it's not just the word. Sometimes it's the internal tone, and we may not be saying it out loud, although sometimes we do. It is with that quality of contempt, which actually has been shown, you know, if you look at the interpersonal research and you look at what are the elements that are most pernicious to any relationship, like some of John Gottman's research, contempt. When contempt is shown in a relationship, it's pretty much, you know, it's pretty much a death sentence for that relationship. And yet that is often the tone that we use with ourselves, is one of contempt. And that language is not benign, even if it's silent. You know, even if it's just language in our own minds, it's not benign. It activates that stress response, a threat response, and it really activates shame.
Yeah, I've been thinking this whole time as you've been talking around how shame, it feels like compassion and shame are two sides of the continuum.
Yeah.
And we're really talking about how to also pull ourselves out of that.
Yes.
It's hard to feel shame and feel compassion for yourself at the same moment.
Yes.
And that this is really an anecdote to those moments of shame and maybe misplaced guilt as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's much, I mean, just like we would instruct a child or a puppy or something, if we just say, stop doing that, don't do that, but we don't give an alternative, right? We don't say, right, stop hitting your brother. We might say that, but we say like, come help me, come help me, whatever, make the cookies or something. We give something else. And so compassion, being compassionate as the antidote to shame, is really an active sense of like being compassionate, and then just notice how the shame will actually dissolve through that process of being compassionate, instead of insisting we not be shameful. Yeah. So one of the other things that I really like to activate nurture, because our minds will so quickly go to double downing on, oh, I can't believe I messed up, I did that, blah, blah, blah. It'll be very ruminative, is to interrupt that and to say, what did I do well? What have I done well today? And it may be the smallest thing, but it actually gives you, again, just in that same frame, like you said, Joan, that it's the other side of the coin, is because we live in this human experience, we are constantly having to hold multiple truths at the same time, and truths that may be in conflict with one another. And so balancing, instead of just that rabbit hole of, what did I do wrong, which is going to activate the whole list of all the things you've ever done wrong, what did I do well today? And what that can do is activate the list of the ways you do show up, how you do show up today, yesterday, and in history. So those are some very concrete strategies of doing this nurture thing. And then sometimes it can be helpful to make something like a hierarchy first for yourself. And it's best to do this outside of a moment of suffering, so that you know for yourself, oh, my patterns when I'm feeling, my habitual pattern is down here when I'm really stressed. But can I create some things for myself on this top part of the hierarchy that actually embody self-kindness? And can I have this available and refer to this? Even because in moments of suffering, we're not as inclined to go towards those things, right? Or to think of them. So can I do the thinking in a time when I'm not suffering, but actually have a little bit of a hierarchy for myself? I'm going to stop there because I know we only have a few minutes, and I don't know if we have time to take maybe a question or two, if there are any.
Let's see. Thank you, everyone. I don't see any questions, but I just want to say thank you to Carrie Raymond, Cecilia Carroll, Dory Pope, and Christy Anderson, because they were participating since the beginning,
Great.
telling us where they are from and how the weather is over there.
Good.
Yeah, and I can go through the reminders so we can get that.
Sure.
Doing that while, please write your questions. And so first, some items to keep in mind. We will send you the instructions and the handouts and the YouTube web address today via email. Now, please reclaim your certificate of attendance or your CME or your CE because that'll prompt the program evaluation where that you'll have to fill while claiming your CME contact hours of attendance certificate. Keep in mind the activity code expires in 1 week. The webinar is going to be on our YouTube channel. And feel free to reach out to me or our office if you have any questions. Now, these are the topics that we're going to be sharing on our second series. It's going to be based on mindful practice and communication topics that we will be addressing. Mindfulness in clinical practice, compassionate leadership, and mindful communication. So you'll be receiving an email within a week or so with the information to register. The time is going to be from noon to 1. Now, I know everybody wants to make sure that they have the right code to claim your credit. It's in front of you. This is the code. And let's see if we have comments or questions. I can see thanks. I deeply appreciate this educational offering. Thank you. Christy tells us great reminders of compassion. I appreciate your presentation. Carrie, the EATS code is right there. And I think we don't have any questions, and so we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Though, if any one of you is from Samaritan, we've worked with IS to get the Zoom block removed. And so we'll be happy to see you in 2 weeks. And thanks to Tina, thanks to Joan. And it's been great.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you
a-
all. Hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.